Good morning. I'd like to ask you to do something for me as we get started this morning. Take a look around for just a minute and smile. It's nice to see, isn't it? It's been a long time since we've been able to see each other's smiling faces, and we just have to assume before that everybody's happy and in a good mood and glad to see that. But why would we not be in a good mood? It's a beautiful day. We're here worshiping our Heavenly Father. It's always a wonderful time when we have these opportunities to gather together and worship God. If you are visiting with us, we are excited to have you with us, and we encourage you to come back and worship with us anytime that you have the opportunity to do so. Enjoyed so much getting back started with Wednesday night Bible class. Due to the weather, our numbers were a little low this past week, but I anticipate those numbers continuing to rise, and encourage you that if you can, make that a part of your schedule to come out on Wednesday nights at 6 o'clock and join us in Bible study, also for our Sunday evening services at 6 o'clock. Before we get into our lesson for the morning, I have a prayer request that I'd like to share with you. I didn't get it to Tom and Carolyn in time to put it on the bulletin. Some of you, I know Ben and Jake, one of my college roommates, a man by the name of Jeremy Tucker. Jeremy is a gospel preacher that lives in Dexter, Missouri, and over the last couple of weeks he has had to resign from preaching because he is facing some very serious heart problems. He's been to the doctor, and there's several things that they are pursuing, but they told him that basically at this point he's not able to work. And Jeremy's still a very young man, has a wife and a young family. He's an outstanding gospel preacher. But if you would, please keep Brother Jeremy Tucker in your prayers. Also, I have to say something about Brother Allison. Growing up in Randolph County, I can't remember a time that I didn't know the name G.W. Allison. But I was in college before I ever met G.W. Allison. I was a student at Crowley's Ridge College, and Brother Allison was holding a meeting at the Bethel congregation over south of Paragould. And I went to hear him one night, and the first thing that really struck me was when he got up to go into the pulpit, he didn't take anything with him. No Bible, no notes, nothing. But I soon realized he didn't need it. He commenced to preach one of the best lessons I've ever heard on the history of the church. 2 weeks later, I went to hear him again in a gospel meeting at Newton Street in Paragould. And for the second time, I heard the best lesson I've ever heard on the history of the church. 2 weeks later, I went and heard him in another gospel meeting. Can't remember where it was, but again, I heard a lesson on the history of the church. Apparently, he had developed a series that he was doing in his meetings that summer, and it just so happened each night that I attended was the night that he was doing that lesson. Well, a year later, when I was working with the church at Hoxie, some of the young people and I, we helped put on a vacation Bible school over at Delaplane, and I invited Brother Allison to come and speak one night to the adults, and he got up and he began to preach about the history of the church. It was the same lesson that I had heard, and he got finished, and he walked up to me, he said, "Brother DeMint, you think you can preach it next time?" But I've always loved Brother Allison. He's always been a great encouragement to me, and I know many of you knew him much better than I did, and I know he means a great deal to you, and I know he thought a great deal about this congregation, even though he worshipped many different places, worked with many different congregations. He said Pyburn Street was always home. And we appreciate so much. Certainly we'll miss him, and our prayers do go out to Sister Fran and all of their family. In the year 1849, a lady by the name of Harriet Tubman escaped from slavery. And almost immediately she became involved in the abolitionist movement. She began to develop meetings where she would speak out against the practice of slavery. But to Tubman, this was not enough. She became active in what was known as the Underground Railroad. She went back into her home state of Maryland. She did this 13 times. And over those 13 trips, she helped bring 300 slaves to freedom. But once again, to her, this was just not enough. So she decided that she was going to expand the range of her activity in the Underground Railroad. And she began to travel into the southern states. And each trip that she made, the danger to her life became much more exponential. She became very infamous, especially among slave owners in the southern states. In fact, for several years during this time that she was so active, there was actually a bounty that was placed upon her head by many in the South. But over the years that she was active, she made 19 separate trips into the southern states, and due to her efforts, more than 700 additional slaves were brought to freedom. Now, I don't believe that there is a single person here who would say that it did not take courage for her to do what she did. She was a very brave lady in making each one of those trips. But the question often arises, what is courage? What is courage? Well, courage is the capacity to do what is right, even in the face of fear. It is putting a mission above our own personal safety. Over the last few weeks, we've been looking at some ways that we can imitate Christ. We started out talking about that we needed to be devoted to God just as Christ was devoted to God. We talked about how we needed to be humble just as Jesus was humble. And then last Sunday, the two lessons that Brother Carey presented on the example of Christ and on treating others in the way that Jesus treated others, I thought fit so well with this overall theme that we're looking at of imitating Christ. And by the way, that wasn't planned, but I thought it fit so well. But this morning, I want us to look at how we need to be courageous like Christ. You know, it is nowhere mentioned in the New Testament that Jesus was courageous. There is not a single place in all of the New Testament where it talks about any type of bravery attributed to Christ. But it doesn't need to be stated. Because throughout the gospel accounts, we see nothing but a constant trail of bravery, of courage on the part of Jesus. But what I want us to do this morning, I want us to look at some of the details of Jesus' courage. Some of the activities that he engaged in that displayed great courage on his part. And some ways that we can apply that to our spiritual lives today. First, we see that Jesus unmasked evil. And we need to do the same. Turn with me, if you would, to Matthew chapter 23. Matthew chapter 23, we're going to begin in verse 31. Matthew 23 and verse 31. Here, Jesus is speaking to a great multitude of people. He has just presented what's commonly called the 7 woes or 7 warnings to these individuals. And now the scribes and the Pharisees, they're a little concerned. They're a little upset with the things that Jesus is saying. But even though Jesus knows the atmosphere of the occasion, he knows that these people aren't very pleased with the things that he's saying. I want you to notice the boldness in the statement that he concludes his thoughts with. Notice there beginning in verse 31. Therefore, you are witnesses against yourselves that you are sons of those who murder the prophets. Fill up then the measure of your father's guilt. Serpents, brood of vipers. How can you escape the condemnation of hell? Jesus states this because of their mistreatment and because of their ancestors' mistreatment of the prophets. He says that all of the righteous blood that you have spilled, he said, you're going to have to answer for all of that. Now that took boldness to make that statement. Even though he knew that those people that were there, they already didn't like the things that he was saying. They were already upset with the message that he was portraying, that he was proclaiming to them at this point. He then sums it all up. He says, but look at yourselves. Look at the attitude that you're portraying. He says, you're just as guilty as your forefathers. He said, they went out, they mistreated the prophets. He said, but now, he said, you still have the same attitude. You still have the same direction that they're taking. He said, you're going to face that guilt as well. He said, you're going to have to face the guilt of the crimes that you're committing. Now, to unmask this evil, Jesus did something that many people are not willing to do, folks. He spoke boldly. He spoke the truth, even though he knew that it wasn't what they wanted to hear. Now, in doing this, he lost the good opinion that many of them had of him before. These religious leaders of the day, up to this point, most of them still had a pretty good impression of Jesus. But in making this statement, he lost that acclaim. In making this statement, they no longer wanted anything to do with Jesus. He lost that good opinion of the people. Now, this does not mean that Jesus was not sensitive to the needs of others. It does not mean that Jesus was not in tune to the fact that, yes, some people will get their feelings hurt. Yes, some people don't like to have their toes stepped on. But what Jesus did understand is that sometimes things are a matter of truth and they have to be said. I don't like saying things that I know is going to offend somebody any more than anybody else. I don't like saying something that I think is going to hurt somebody's feelings or shame somebody. But when it's the truth, we have to boldly unmask evil. We have to have the courage to do this. Jesus said these things because they were true. Are we willing to do the same thing? Are we willing to have that same degree of courage? That regardless of what it might make someone else think of us, if it's the truth, that's what we're going to stand up for. That's what we're going to promote. Do we have enough courage to do that? Do we have enough courage to speak the truth boldly? Now turn to Luke 13. In Luke 13, verses 10 through 17, we find the story of Jesus healing a woman who had been crippled for 18 years. After Jesus healed this woman, the leaders of the synagogue came to him and began to rebuke him. Began to criticize him and condemn him for performing this act of kindness for her. Well, Jesus, as he so often did, he responded by asking them a question. Notice verse 17. And when he had said these things, all his adversaries were put to shame, and all the multitude rejoiced for all the glorious things that were done by him. Now stop and think for just a moment. I skipped ahead a couple verses for a reason. Notice what happened with the question that he asked. It says that it brought to shame those that asked it. Well, what was the question? Well, the question was, why did you do this on the Sabbath day? Well, Jesus responded with another question. And I'm paraphrasing here. He said, which one of you goes out and waters your livestock on the Sabbath day? Which one of you makes sure that your livestock has the things that it needs? He says, if you're going to do that, then why can't I perform the same type of act of kindness for this woman? He says, essentially, if a Jewish man can go out and perform an act of kindness for an animal, then why can a Jewish man not go out and perform an act of kindness for a Jewish woman? And it brought him to shame. There was no response that they could make to that. And those that were there that heard this, they were amazed at the things that they were seeing and that they were hearing. But what he was doing, he was unmasking their hypocrisy. He was showing that they were hypocritical in their practices. Yes, they were taking upon themselves the image of being faithful to God. They had a form of righteousness, remember, but it wasn't right. It wasn't based upon truth. They were put to shame. Essentially, Jesus is saying, if you can loose your animals on the Sabbath, why can't I loose this woman's infirmity? They couldn't answer it. There was no response because their hypocrisy was so visible. What happened? He taught a crippling lesson on that day. Are we doing the same type of thing? Are we unmasking the evils that come along? But then we turn to John chapter 10. John chapter 10, verses 22 through 39, and we're not going to read this whole passage, but if you're taking notes, you might want to jot that down and go back and read it at some point. Here, Jesus is in the temple, and he is confronted by some of the Jews that are there. Jesus, tell us, are you really the Son of God? Tell us, are you this Messiah? Are you the one that everybody says that you are? And Jesus responds in a very interesting way. He says, I've already told you that. I've already answered that question for you, and I'm not going to answer it again. He says, I've answered it, and you're still not believing. Well, if they weren't able to take his word for it, if they weren't able to look at the miracles that he was performing and place their faith in him due to that, then he knew that simply by answering this question, it wasn't going to be enough to get them to believe in him. So he goes on in verse 30 and he makes this affirmation. He says, I and my Father are one. At this point, picture this image. In the eyes of the Jews, what Jesus has just done is blaspheme God. I can picture this image of them reaching down and picking up stones. They're ready to put him to death for what he's just done. But Jesus asks a question. He says, which one of my works has demanded this? What is it that I have done that has led you to want to put me to death? And I kind of get this mental image of them kind of stammering a little bit by that. Well, it wasn't one of your works. It was what you said. It wasn't what you were doing. What you're doing is all good things. But it's what you said. You blasphemed God. You claimed to be equal with God. Well, Jesus then responded back to that. He said, if I'm doing the things of God, then am I not equal with God? Basically, he says, if I'm doing these things by the authority of God, these things that only a son of God would be able to do, basically he's saying, look at the things I've done. Is this not evidence to you? Do you not see the power there? He was doing the works of God. And he says, you should believe in me. Believe the things I say because of the things that you see in me. Well, at this, they still didn't like what he said. They tried to seize him once again, but he slips through their fingers. He escapes. But in order to unmask that evil, he had to say things they didn't want to hear. He had to speak out, even though it meant that it was putting his life in danger. Now, at face value, if we remove everything else that we know about Jesus, if we were standing there on that day, we had never heard about Jesus, had never seen any of the things that Jesus did, and this man stands up and he says, I and my Father are one, what would be our first thought? That's blasphemy. So at face value, if they didn't know any of these other things that they already did know about Jesus, if they didn't know any of those things, then they would have the right to lay that charge against him. But Jesus says, you've seen all these things. You know the things that I'm doing. You've witnessed it. You need to believe in him. But in our society today, we're told that it's not black and white. We're told that everything has a gray area. That everything is subjective. It's up to you. It's up to the individual. Whatever feels right to you, then that's what's right. There's no absolute rights. There's no absolute wrongs. But Jesus and the apostles never subscribed to that philosophy. In fact, they always preached two ways. Right and wrong. Think about it for just a moment. They preached a broad way or a narrow way. They preached that you either accept Christ or you reject Christ. They preached that you either live in darkness or you come to the light. They laid out those two options, and then they encouraged people to accept God's way. They encouraged people to do what was right. Do we have the ability to do that? Are we willing to confront evil in that way? Of saying, you know what, there's two choices you can make, because it's the same today. People can still make the same choices today that they made in the first century. Are you going to choose what's right or what's wrong? What's good or what's evil? Do we have the ability to lay that out? Do we have the courage to make those options known and then encourage people to choose the right? We need to unmask evil. And we do that by being courageous. We need to be courageous like Christ. Next, we see that Jesus confronted his Jerusalems. And yes, I put an S on the end of that. Jesus confronted his Jerusalems. And so should we. In Luke 9 and verse 51, it says that Jesus steadfastly set his face to go to Jerusalem. Now this displayed great courage in and of itself, because Jesus knew that by him going to Jerusalem that he was walking into a religious powder keg that was ready to explode. He knew that by him going to Jerusalem that it was going to stir things up and that it was not going to end well for him. But he knew that the mission that God had set for him was more important than any risk there was to him physically. The mission of fulfilling God's will was the most important thing to Jesus. As we look at Luke chapter 22, Jesus reveals some of the ways that he knows that he is going to suffer. Verses 47 through 53, he experiences the sting of being betrayed by a friend. And even though he knew that this was going to happen, it still didn't take away the pain when Judas was the one that came along and betrayed him. But also we find Jesus even suffered betrayal from another friend. But Luke tells us in Luke 21 and verse 16, Jesus states that we're going to be betrayed in this life. It says you're going to be betrayed even by parents and brothers and relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death. Are we able to confront betrayal? Are we able to be courageous enough that regardless of who it is that wants to betray us, we're going to continue to put God first in our life? Regardless of how close that relationship may be, regardless of how near and dear that person may be to our heart, if they betray us, are we going to put God first? Verses 54 through 62. Jesus tells Peter that even he is going to deny him. He says, Peter, you're going to do it 3 times. He says, you need to pray. He says, Peter, pray. Well, Peter didn't pray. Very soon that rooster crowed and that reality sank in. Peter had denied Christ. That was a betrayal. Denied even knowing Jesus 3 times. Jesus knew the pain of betrayal. But Jesus also knew the pain of denial. For Jesus warned us, do not think that I came to bring peace on earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against a father, a daughter against her mother, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and a man's enemies will be those of his own household. Matthew 10, 34 through 35. But then I want you to notice verses 63 through 65 of Luke 22. Jesus is being mocked. He's being beaten. He's suffering the hurt of ridicule. It says, now the men who held Jesus mocked him and beat him. And having blindfolded him, they struck him on the face and asked him, saying, prophesy, who is the one who struck you? And many other things they blasphemously spoke against him. Jesus knew the hurt of ridicule. They were making fun of him. criticizing him for who he was. Are we courageous enough to face that ourselves? Already, to a certain degree, we're starting to face some of that in our country. And more than likely, that ridicule is only going to increase. But are we going to be courageous enough that even in the face of denial and criticism and ridicule, that we're going to stand up for Jesus? Just as Brother Tom led us in that song, stand up for Jesus. Are we willing to do that? Are we willing to be courageous enough to say that no matter what Satan puts in our path, we're standing up for Jesus? We are going to be courageous. Jesus also suffered persecution. He was courageous in doing this, and so should we. In Matthew 12, verses 22 through 30, we find an incident where a demon-possessed man who was blind and mute has been brought to Jesus. Jesus healed this man. Well, this amazed the people. It would have amazed me. If I had been there and I had saw that, that would have been amazing to me. But it amazed the people who were there. And they began to reason among themselves, could this be the Savior? Could this be the Messiah, the one that has been prophesied? Could this be the Son of David? Well, the Pharisees began to hear some of the things that the people were saying. And the Pharisees spoke up, no, don't you be thinking that way. No, this isn't the Son of God. He said, this man's casting out devils with the power of Beelzebub. Basically, you're casting out devils with the power of the devil. Well, Jesus very quickly reveals the absurdity of that claim. Because he asks them a question. Notice verses 29 and 30. He said, how can one enter a strong man's house and plunder his goods unless he first binds the strong man? And then he will plunder his house. In essence, what Jesus is saying, he says, would I not have to have power over the devil in order to cast out the devil? Think about that. Would I not have to have control over Satan in order to cast out one of his devils? He then adds, he who is not with me is against me. And he who does not gather with me scatters abroad. Well, where does this leave his accusers? Where does this leave them? Well, Jesus responds to the persecution of false accusation. And he responds to it with the truth. You know, we can expect this as well. Jesus says in Matthew 5 and verse 11, blessed are you when they revile you and persecute you and say all kinds of evil against you falsely for my sake. Folks, we know the truth. We know the truth. And we know the enlightenment that comes to those who know the truth. And we know that those who are in darkness, that they need to come to that light. Are we willing to be courageous even when someone speaks falsely against us, even when rumors are spread about us? Are we courageous enough to stand up, to face that persecution, and keep Christ first in our life? Are we willing to keep moving toward that light, living in the light of that Christian influence? In Matthew chapter 22, verses 15 through 22, we find another incident where Jesus is facing some of the Pharisees. The Pharisees went and plotted how they might entangle Jesus in his talk. They were trying to find some way that they could trip him up. Folks, I've been here long enough to know, I've been here long enough for you to know that sometimes I misspeak. Sometimes I can't come out with the words that I want to say. Sometimes I say one word and it's not really the word that I intended for it to be. Well, the Jews were trying to find a way that they could get Jesus to misspeak. They wanted Jesus to say something that they could use against him. Well, Jesus knew their heart. Jesus knew what they were trying to do. He wasn't going to let that happen. So they come up with a trick question. And the question they ask, is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar? Well, if Jesus said, yes, it is, then he would have lost his popularity with the Jews who hated the Romans. But if he had said, no, it's not, then the Pharisees could have run to the Romans and could have said, this man's saying you don't have to pay your taxes. So Jesus is kind of in a catch-22. How's he going to answer the question? He simply says, does somebody have a coin? And he takes that coin and he looks at that coin and he said, whose inscription is this on this coin? And they said, it's Caesar's. He said, well, render to Caesar what's Caesar's, and render to God those things that are God's. So basically, he said that if this is what Caesar expects and this is Caesar's money, then give it to him. But those things that belong to God, you be sure and you give those things to God. Jesus knew what they were trying to do. He knew they were trying to trip him up, but he answered these critics with such godly wisdom. And even when Jesus was nailed to the cross, suffering such pain, you had those people at the foot of the cross that were crying out to him, come down from the cross. You've healed all these other people. Bring yourself down from the cross. You say that you're the Son of God. You can do it. How many of us would have been tempted to do that? Probably many of us would have been tempted to use the power that we had to relieve some of that pain. Did Jesus have the ability to come down from the cross? Yes. He had the authority to do that. He could have called the angels and they could have brought him down. But he didn't. And you know why? Because even though Jesus had the power to do that, Jesus could not use his power against God's will. And God's will was that he be that perfect sacrifice for our sins. And so courageously he hung there on that cross, being mocked and ridiculed, having people challenge and taunt him and want him to prove his power to them once again. But he had the courage to simply submit to this, to do the Lord's will. And lastly, Jesus overcame fear. And we need to do the same. In Matthew chapter 10, verses 24 through 31, Jesus begins this passage by laying down a principle for us. He says, if others have mistreated and killed me, then others will treat my followers in the same way. Folks, that's not good news. Those that heard that, they didn't want to hear that. In fact, it was terrifying news. Because Jesus was telling them, he says, I'm going to be put to death, and many of you are going to face the same thing. But then notice what he says. Verse 26, therefore do not fear them. Verse 28, and do not fear those who kill the body. Verse 31, do not fear, therefore, you are of more value than many sparrows. 3 times in 5 verses, Jesus tells us, do not fear. Don't be afraid of the things that are going to come along in this life. Jesus reassures us that regardless of what we face, that we can do so without fear. I want you to think about Jesus for just a moment. Think about when he was arrested. Think about standing before Caiaphas, standing before Pilate, before Herod, being strapped to that pole, getting ready to be beaten, being nailed to the cross. Those are things that terrify me just to think about. But Jesus faced each one of those things with a fearless courage. We need to overcome the fears that are in our life that may be holding us back from living our life as we should. Those things that are keeping us from living a faithful Christian life, lay those things aside. Don't live your life in fear. Overcome those fears. Be courageous like Jesus. I want to leave you this morning with a story. There was a young Muslim man who had grown up in Iran, but he had fled to Greece. He had relatives that lived there. And while he was in Greece, he found a Bible. Now you have to understand how dangerous this was for this young man. He would wait till his uncles went to sleep at night, and he would pull out the Bible and begin to read. Soon he came to the understanding that the Muslim faith was not the truth. And he came to the understanding that he needed to obey the gospel. And he made a decision that one Sunday in 2006, he was going to get up early. He was going to leave home before his uncles woke up. He was going to go to the local church and was going to be baptized into Christ. But unbeknownst to him, his cousin found out about his plan. And before the alarm went off at 6 o'clock, his cousin went into the kitchen, boiled a large pot of water, carried it into the bedroom, and dumped it on this young man. Scalded over half of his body, but in tremendous pain, displaying great courage, this young man got up and he went to church. Their suffering, the burns visible to those who were there, he made that good confession of faith. He was baptized into Christ. And as he came out of the water, he said these words, "No matter what they do to me, I will follow Jesus." Can we say the same thing today? Can we have that same courage that no matter what the world does to us, no matter what Satan puts in our path, we're going to follow Jesus? This morning, if you examine yourself and you find that in your life you've not been unmasking those evils, you've not been confronting your Jerusalems, you've not been suffering persecutions and overcoming your fears to be courageous like Jesus, then I encourage you this morning to make that commitment today. Begin this very hour living a strong, devoted Christian life. If you examine yourself and you find that as a child of God that you've grown weak, that you're no longer as faithful as you once were, that you've allowed sin to enter into your life and to pull you away from God, or maybe you're going through a time of trial or discouragement and you simply need the prayers and the encouragement of your brothers and sisters, please make that known. Come forward and let us know what those needs are in your life so that we can be of assistance to you. Or it may be that there's someone here who has never obeyed the gospel. And this morning it may be that something has been said that has convicted you of the fact that Jesus is the Son of God. And today you're ready to act upon that faith. Then this morning we encourage you, turn away from your old life. Turn away from sin. Set your sights on things above. Come forward. Confess that you believe that Jesus is the Son of God. Be baptized. Have your sins washed away. God will add you to the church. Today, you can begin living a faithful and courageous Christian life. This morning, if you examine yourself and you need to respond to the Lord's invitation, we encourage you to come at this time while we stand and sing.